Hello and welcome to the JMU podcast. I'm Barış Kabak. In this program, we will discuss the many shades and colors of bilingualism. Joining me today from Edinburgh is my guest, Antonella Sorace, Professor of Developmental Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. She's a Fellow of the British Academy, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. Her research lies at the interface of linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science. Among other topics, Professor Sorace is renowned for her research on bilingualism over the lifespan, in particular for her scientific work concerning adult second language speakers who have attained a near-native level of proficiency in their second language, as well as the effects of bilingualism in domains outside language, such as cognitive abilities. Professor Sorace is committed to disseminating the findings of research on bilingualism outside academia. She is the founding director of the Information and Consultancy Center in Edinburgh called Bilingualism Matters. The center scientifically explores bilingualism and language acquisition and communicates the scientific knowledge to help people make informed decisions about a host of issues surrounding bilingualism. Run by an international team of researchers, Bilingualism Matters has also partner branches in many countries around the world, including Germany. In the second part of today's program, we'll be joined by Christina Domene Moreno, researcher and lecturer at the University of Würzburg, who has carried out experimental work on how different language systems interact in the minds of bilinguals. In particular, when child and adult Turkish-German bilinguals learn and engage with additional languages. Professor Sorace, dear Antonella, welcome to the program. It's a great pleasure to have you here on the JMU podcast. You're not only known for your high-impact work on the psycholinguistics of bilingualism, but also for your advocacy of bilingualism in many spheres of life, which has culminated in your inspiring public engagement on matters of bilingualism. We will move on to the definitions and many shades of bilingualism later on in the program, but I'd like to start off with an inspiring quote that I found on the website of the Consultancy Center, Bilingualism Matters, which you founded in 2008 to serve, so to speak, as a bridge between the specialist and the non-specialist on a variety of issues concerning the nature and impacts of bilingualism. So the quote says, "We think that everyone can enjoy the benefits of having more than one language." My question is, why does bilingualism matter, and how does your research as a developmental linguist and the Center Bilingualism Matters promote this idea?
Thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, I'm really happy to be here. Yes, first of all, my research is in experimental linguistics, broadly speaking, and I do research on how languages are learned, so bilingualism in a broad sense, over the lifespan. So what it means to have more than one language, from infants to older adults, and all the way from, going through older children, young adults, and then older adults. And I'm also interested as a linguist on how languages change in individuals and across generations. Now, bilingualism matters. I think people don't know enough about bilingualism. And that's why I decided to do something about it as a parent as well, because I'm the parent of bilingual sons. And so I'm aware of not only the benefits, but also the challenges that may actually arise when parents raise their children bilingual. And so I think that researchers have some responsibility to make sure that their research actually reaches people who are making decisions about bilingualism all the time, whether it's their own children or their own students or their patients or their policies or their businesses. And that's why I decided to do something to bridge the gap between research and society. In other words, bringing research to people in very different sectors of society in such a way that they can make informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. There are so many different definitions of bilingualism based on many different criteria and factors, for example, depending on the manner and setting in which the additional language in question has been learned or is being used along with one's first language. So we hear terms like late versus early bilingual, simultaneous bilingual, coordinate bilingual, even passive bilingual. Are there traditionally established notions to define who is a bilingual, like a yardstick to judge how skilled a person should be in each of the languages in order for him or her to be referred to as bilingual?
There are indeed many different definitions and types of bilingualism. I would think that bilingualism is clearly not a categorical variable. It's not either or, either you're bilingual or you're not bilingual. Bilingualism is a continuum that is affected by many different kinds of variables. And so that's why we use the term bilingual to refer to having more than one language. Other terms used, as we know, are multilingualism or increasingly plurilingualism. That seems to be another term, that seems to denote more bilingualism and knowledge of more than one language in social contexts. So we really need to understand the different factors that affect bilingualism and multilingualism. And we also need to understand that bilingualism doesn't mean the sum of two monolinguals. And this is a very, very important factor because even when people are not aware of doing that, but both in research and in society, we often compare bilinguals with monolinguals. And so implicitly, we expect bilinguals to behave like a monolingual in language A and monolingual in language B. And I think we should really stop doing that. First of all, for various reasons. First, because the perfect bilingual doesn't exist. In bilinguals or multilinguals, there's always a difference in level of competence. It could be a small difference. It could be a larger difference. It depends on what we are talking about, where we are, who we are talking to. And so one language can be ahead of the other. Then if the situation changes, the balance among the languages can change too. And so again, this is an additional reason why we shouldn't talk about bilinguals as two monolinguals in one. But unfortunately, as I said, in practice, in many cases, the point of reference that we use to judge bilinguals is the monolingual norm. And we should really not do that. There's another reason why we shouldn't be doing that. And I do research on this, so I think it's an important point. Our native languages change as a result of exposure and knowledge of other languages. So again, you're not a native speaker for life in the sense that, yes, you're a native speaker because you were born and raised with a particular language. But that doesn't mean having a competence that never changes, a competence that can affect your learning of other languages, but is not affected in turn by having other languages. I think it's very normal, it's completely normal that both languages affect each other, the native language and a second language. So, and the effects go in both directions. So this is another reason why we should really stop using the monolingual point of reference to judge bilingualism.
So from an evolutionary perspective, do you think the human brain has developed in a way to deal with more than one language?
Possibly, yes. I think so. And we should remember that multilingualism is more widespread than monolingualism.
The norm, so rather than the exception.
It's the norm. So why do we use the monolingual norm? Well, I would like to think that it's because most of the research that is being done, I would say both in linguistics and in other language-related fields, has been done and has thrived in monolingual societies. And therefore, typically also Anglo-centric societies, but that's another aspect that could be discussed. But definitely, monolingual societies. And therefore, even in linguistics, we've always used the idealized, ideal monolingual speaker as the point of reference. And the ideal monolingual speaker is a fiction, possibly.
You're a native of Sardinia, but due to your scientific career, you've spent a considerable amount of time, I would say, in other parts of the world, primarily in English-speaking countries. In this wide range of definitions of bilingualism, what type of bilingual do you consider yourself?
Well, actually, I'm not a native speaker of Sardinian. My mother was from Sardinia, but interestingly, I was born in northern Italy, and my mother never spoke Sardinian to me because she didn't think that Sardinian was very useful. And this is a very good example of misconception, one of the many misconceptions that we're trying to do something about. So in her view, and she was an educated woman, but in her view, Sardinian was not very useful. It's only spoken in one island. So learning English is much more useful. And so the idea that if you give a child a minority language like Sardinian, somehow you compromise the ability to learn another useful language. And I think, research shows exactly the opposite, that the more languages you know, the easier it becomes to learn other languages. So even from that point of view alone, I wish I had been spoken to in Sardinian, but I wasn't. However, I heard enough Sardinian around me that I developed passive competence in Sardinian. So I grew up with Italian, with passive understanding of Sardinian. I can't speak it, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So you mean standard Italian used in legislation and education?
Standard Italian with a regional accent, the northeast regional accent of Italian spoken there. And I didn't learn English until I was an adolescent. I started during my adolescence.
So the situation of Sardinian as a minority regional language, I believe that this is unfortunately receding, right? The number of native speakers. I wonder what some of the public perceptions of learning Sardinian in Italy is right now. And I mean, the same question may apply to other minority languages such as Welsh in Great Britain, for that matter, and you live in the UK. So these are the contexts where there's a country and there's a dominant language that is used as an official language in many spheres of social life, such as education and legislation. And there is this heritage language. And what are the perceptions of these minority languages by the general public?
That's a very interesting question, and we do a lot of work on regional minority languages from different points of view. I mean, as a linguist, I want to preserve linguistic diversity. Linguistic diversity is very important because it also means cultural diversity. And unfortunately, languages are dying at a very, very fast rate. It's been calculated that, there's a language that dies every week or something like that of the approximately 6,000, 7,000 languages that are there in the world. So preserving linguistic diversity is important. It's fundamental for humanity. And in many cases, these languages can only survive in a context of bilingualism with a majority language. So we have to deal with this issue. Public perception of minority languages is not very positive, usually. And my mother was an example, right? So they are not regarded as particularly useful. People, again, don't know that the brain can handle, more than 2 languages. And so they think that there are languages that are desirable, they are instrumentally useful. What makes a language instrumentally useful and desirable? Well, the level and degree of economic and political power that goes with it, right? So English is, at the moment, a desirable, a prestigious language. Chinese is on the rise. Until 40 years ago, Chinese was not a language that, was regarded as prestigious or desirable. Now it is. But many other languages are there and they're dying because parents don't speak them to their children anymore. So if that intergenerational transmission breaks down, the language is doomed. So that's what we are trying to do, from the point of view of public engagement. We are trying to equip families, but also schools, society in general, with enough knowledge about the importance of speaking these languages to their children. Speaking these languages, first of all, is not a waste of time. It can be good for the family as well. because it creates, family emotions and dynamics that can only be given in that particular language, for example. But also it's good for the brain. We can talk about this in more detail later. So having more than one language in the brain is very good. And so people who have a language at their doorstep, they're very, very lucky. And they should regard this as a privilege. They should regard this as something to invest a lot of time and a lot of energies in. Governments should invest resources in maintaining these languages. But that is part of a broader information campaign that involves not only families, but also politicians, policymakers, teachers, and so on. So maintaining minority languages is definitely one of our priorities.
I really like the metaphor you use, the language at your doorstep or doorway. It's an asset, basically. It's a cultural capital.
Absolutely. It's an asset, it's a resource. It's a resource that people should really do everything they can to maintain.
Mm-hmm. Going back to different perceptions of bilingualism, you already alluded to some misconceptions, misunderstandings about bilingualism. What are some of the most disturbing or, let's say, counterproductive misconceptions about bilingualism for you?
Well, there's quite a list. I think I would like to say that there are many long-standing misconceptions, so old misconceptions that are still around. There's a number of new misconceptions that are arising. So let's start from, so we are at a very lucky time where we're dealing both with the old misconceptions, but also some new misconceptions that weren't there until recently. Mm-hmm. So the old misconceptions, well, for children learning more than one language, for example, the idea that two languages too soon makes a child confused. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's better to wait until the first language is well established before you introduce the other. There's absolutely no evidence that that's the case. A brain can deal with more than one language. Again, a child needs to hear both languages. So there's no genetic transmission of languages. It's not that because a child has parents who speak two different languages, the two languages are automatically acquired if there is no exposure to the two languages in sufficient amounts. But this idea that, the child's brain, particularly a baby's brain, is too young, to deal with this is still around. It's still around. And, later in life, the idea is that you can't really learn a language very well unless you are a child. So if you're an adult, you can learn a few things, but certainly not as well as a child. Now, it's true that, there are big differences between children and adults in terms of life experience, right? A child has the privilege of being absolutely immersed in a language without distractions, without jobs, without families, and so on. Adults very often don't have that privilege, right? They have other things to worry about. Also, they may not have the motivation to learn everything in the language. They may have they may need to learn a language for particular purposes and so on. So there are differences that have nothing to do with the cognitive ability to learn another language. And we know that there are many adults who can reach very high levels of competence in another language. Maybe not, across the board. Maybe not, from a phonological point of view. Accents are, the most obvious difference between learning a language as a child and learning a language as an adult. But from a grammatical point of view, it's perfectly possible to reach very high levels of competence in a second language. And so I think, we should encourage everybody to learn another language. And more often, we are encouraging even much older people to start learning another language. They may not have the time scale, in front of them. If they start in their 70s or the 80s, they may not have the time scale to learn a language, to a very high level. But we have evidence that the brain responds very well to the challenge of learning another language. And so why not?
So you mentioned some of the new misconceptions. I'm really curious about them.
The new misconceptions arise out of a misreading of current research. very often, right? So, for example, the research on bilingual, so-called bilingual advantages for certain areas of cognition. So there is research on benefits of bilingualism in a wide range of contexts, but I think there are some areas of research that are more prominent than others. And so they have become more visible in the media, for example. So there is more of a debate or more of a controversy, if you want. We can come back to that from a research point of view. But unfortunately, this has a potentially, it can have a negative effect on public perception of bilingualism in two different ways. Misreading of research that says, if you are bilingual, if you raise your child bilingual, your child becomes more intelligent. Okay, so it really, you turn your child into a genius. Not true. I mean, we're not talking about intelligence. We're talking about an extra gear that allows a child and then an adult to do better in a wide variety of situations. Similarly, the benefits of bilingualism for aging. That's another area that can be misunderstood. So I get journalists asking me, is it true that if you're bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's? And, the answer is, of course, it's not true. What is true is that bilingualism can delay the appearance of the initial symptoms of these diseases and therefore, give the individual 4 or 5 years of independent life in addition to what they would normally enjoy. So these are misunderstandings of the current research. On the other hand, because there is a controversy, some people are saying, but some of these benefits haven't been found everywhere, therefore they don't exist. Which is again, not a legitimate conclusion, because the fact that these benefits are not found in every single study is due to the fact that, as I said at the beginning, bilingualism is a continuum affected by many different variables: cognitive, social, individual, experiential, and all of these need to be properly understood. And there is a lot of research that we need to do to understand the effects of these variables and how they can create a context that is more favorable for the emergence of these benefits.
So you've already mentioned that this advantage, to the so-called bilingual advantage, does not manifest itself in terms of higher or more intelligence, but in other cognitive domains. So I'd like to go back to that, and I would like to hear your opinion as to what effect dealing with two language systems in the same mind would have for linguistic and cognitive development of children. So apparently we're not talking about intelligence, but there are, like you said, there are studies that show clear effects, positive effects of bilinguals. And in this case, we're comparing them with a monolingual population.
Yes, which is a problematic, as we said before, but let's use that comparison. Again, the proper comparison should be between more or less bilingual rather than bilingual and monolingual. But let's have a look at these benefits. From a linguistic point of view, from the point of view of language, it has been found that growing up with more than one language, again, not necessarily from birth, it can be one language first and then another, can make a child more aware of how language works in general. So meta-linguistic awareness, what is normally called, right? An awareness, not necessarily explicit. So we're not talking about knowledge of grammatical rules in a way that an adult, would call, they go to a language classroom and they are taught how the grammar works by their teacher. No, we're talking about an implicit understanding of how language works that a child can get. And that is also what makes children and then adults also better at learning other languages if they know more than one, but also potentially better at understanding the structure of the majority language. And this is one of the points that we try to get across to teachers and educators, because very often, the misconception is that a child who comes from a bilingual background, particularly if they are, say, a migrant, a family or that comes from a different language background, their child has to be schooled in the majority language this child has a disadvantage. Well, does it really have a disadvantage? They have to learn the language of the community, of course. And they can learn the language of the community if they are exposed to enough input of it, right? But it's not that the home language is a disadvantage. On the contrary, there are more and more studies that show that having another language can actually help, the implicit understanding of the language of schooling, if that is recognized and if that is, seen as a potential advantage. And so that's why we tell, families not to stop speaking their home language. Of course, their child has to learn enough English, German, whatever the majority language is, but not from their parents. It's much better if they keep speaking their home language with their parents, because that can increase this metalinguistic ability in their children. So that's from a language point of view. From a general cognitive point of view, I would like to mention two main benefits that have been found. One actually has to do with social cognition, what we call social cognition. So this has to do with an understanding that other people can have a different perspective from your own. So understanding that it is possible to have a different point of view, to see things from a different perspective. And a greater awareness in this respect comes from the fact that any bilingual child learns very quickly that not everybody is bilingual, or not everybody is bilingual with the same languages. And so they have to choose the right language depending on who they are talking to. And that means stepping outside their own shoes, so to speak, and temporarily embrace the other person's linguistic perspective. And that experience that has its roots in bilingualism, in the language experience, is extended outside the language domain and leads to a better understanding that it is possible to have a different perspective in general. So both from a spatial point of view, obviously, you're sitting there, okay, you're a great distance, but, I can't see what, you have next to you because I'm not next to you. But also ranging from spatial perspectives to beliefs, right? It is possible to see things from a different point of view. How important is that in today's society? Extremely important. Being able to appreciate that different points of view are possible and different perspectives are possible. So that is a very good benefit of bilingualism that doesn't receive as much attention as it should. Mm-hmm. What really receives a lot of attention, as I said, is this range of benefits for attention. So the way we pay attention to what we're doing, which is definitely very important, because we have to pay attention to what we're doing, otherwise we don't do it well. And there's always distracting factors that could take our attention away from what we're doing. So what research on bilingualism has shown is that bilingual children and then bilingual adults are better at paying focused attention on what matters for the task they're doing, at the same time without being distracted by irrelevant information or irrelevant factors that are not important for what they're doing. So this is what goes under the name of selective attention or focused attention, and the ability to inhibit or exclude irrelevant information. Now, where does that come from? And the root of this benefit is the fact that in all bilinguals, all languages are simultaneously active. Bilinguals in a broad sense, right? Bilinguals or multilinguals. All languages are simultaneously active at the same time. So when one speaks one language, the other languages have to be excluded. They have to be inhibited. So I'm speaking Italian to you. No, I'm speaking English to you. But my Italian is very much active as well as the other languages that I speak. And so my brain is working overtime to exclude these languages. And this happens to all bilinguals and multilinguals. So again, it's an experience that has its roots in the bilingual experience, but it's extended outside the language domain and leads to a better cognitive control of attention.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying essentially is that bilingual children have this special experience with switching on and off the languages that they have, and that because of that experience, which monolingual children do not have, they show advantages in experimental studies. And we're talking usually about younger children, right? In these psycholinguistic studies, the target group is usually younger bilinguals.
We're talking about younger, many studies have been done on children, but some studies have been done on adults as well. So it's not that these benefits have only been found in children. And there are many aspects that need more attention. As I said, this area is controversial precisely because it's one of the areas where more studies have been done and more studies have been replicated, or the attempt to replicate these studies. So should we be surprised that the results are not found in every single study? I don't think so, simply because bilingualism is not the same in every single context. So we need to understand what, as I said before, what makes this particular context of bilingualism different from this other particular context of bilingualism. From a linguistic point of view, again, as a linguist, one of the factors that we don't fully understand yet is the relationship between the two languages. So, are the two languages typologically similar or different? We don't have enough data to judge whether this can make a difference from the point of view of switching, and inhibiting the other language. Because, you can imagine different scenarios. If you have two very similar languages, on the one hand, you may think, you need to apply more inhibition to the other language when you speak the other, right? On the other hand, if you speak to people who are equally bilingual in these languages, chances are that you're going to get understood because the two languages are similar. So there is no need to really, really inhibit the other language, or not the same need as when, you have a bilingual speaking, Chinese and English, for example, which are very, very different languages.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because, it also depends on the individual or the context in which the multilingual individual is. Just to give you an example, I consider myself trilingual, and I find myself in situations where I'm grading a term paper in English and at the same time listening to the news in German, and also trying to answer a question that my wife asked in Turkish. So these are all happening at the same time. I don't have the luxury of inhibiting, actually, each single language, because these are all happening literally at the same time. So as you said, it really depends on the typological distance on the one hand, but also the type of bilingualism, the type of multilingualism that one has.
And in the type of society where one lives, and there are communities where everybody speaks both languages, right? So is there a need to inhibit one of the languages? Not really, because all languages are spoken in all contexts. And this is different from a really what we call a diglossic situation, where language A is only spoken in one context, language B everywhere else. So Sardinian is one example of this. Sardinian tends to be spoken at home. And not outside the home, people speak Italian. And so, in that context, you really need to inhibit the language you're not speaking.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would like to move on to another interesting topic, which is definitely related to this. So apart from being a cultural capital, we use terms like an asset. Languages that we additionally learn can be said to form a cognitive reserve, staving off neurodegenerative diseases such as dementia or the Alzheimer's disease, as you mentioned. But bilinguals' languages may also have an adverse effect on their first languages. And this is an area known as first language attrition, something that people may immediately associate with forgetting their first language. Now, the question is, can we really lose our first languages due to voluntary or involuntary language shift or consequent dominance of an additional language in our lifespan?
Thank you for the question. This is one of the questions at the core of my own research, so I feel I have something to say about this. So attrition is a negative term. Let's start from that. Attrition really denotes erosion, loss. And originally, the first, original research on attrition was done on communities that had left their original country, speakers who had left their original language community for good. We're talking about, first waves of migration, at the beginning of last century, where, you didn't have internet, you didn't have cheap flights. So, leaving the original community was really, forever. And keeping in touch with the original language was also very, very difficult. So clearly, there are many different situations now, where people continue to get in touch or to keep in touch with their own mother tongue. So we can't just talk about loss, also because loss really suggests permanent effects, irreversible effects. Now, what we know from more recent research is two things. One is that changes in the native language are completely normal and entirely predictable. They're also selective. They don't affect the whole of the grammar to the same extent. They tend to affect certain areas of the grammar, but not others. And these are in first generation people. Okay, so I'm making a distinction between first generation people who were born and raised with one language and then started using a second language or moved to another country where the second language is spoken. Second generation is a different matter, and we'll come back to that. But with first generation people, changes do happen, but they are selective, they are very restricted, and they are reversible. So we have research that shows that when people are re-immersed in their original community, those changes can be at least partly reversed. We still don't have the time scale, to see whether they are completely reversible. But definitely, even 2 weeks of complete re-immersion in the original community can partly undo the changes that could be noticed before. So that means that, it's not that something really changes in a permanent way in the knowledge that these people have in their language. What changes is the access to the knowledge that people have. And the access is clearly influenced by the frequency of practice of the language. So the fewer opportunities they have to speak their language, the slower the access to certain areas of grammar becomes. And I also mean words. So one of the most one of the clearest manifestations of this kind of attrition is slower access to words or lexical access. So yes, finding words we're talking about not big differences, right? But, if you do a proper experiment, you can realize that people are slower at accessing words in their native language. But that can be undone by re-exposure. So it's a question of accessing, the psycholinguistic mechanisms used to access the knowledge. Those are affected by attrition in first generation, but not the knowledge itself. Now, when those people actually speak to their children, that's a different story because, I'm an attrited speaker, attrited. I'm using this negative term because that's the term used in the literature. I don't like it, but, let's use it for the time being. My Italian is experiencing attrition, right? Like your Turkish, right?
Yeah.
We speak to our children, right? So our children get input primarily from us, right? So they get input which is different from the input we got from our non-attrited parents, okay? So input which is more variable, first of all, right? And so, this increased variation can actually mean that our children start acquiring a different grammar or a different language. So that is a different kind of change because at that point, you can start noticing changes in the knowledge from one generation to the next. And that is, again, completely normal. That's the way languages change. Languages in contact change over time. Diachronic change, it's, again, perfectly normal, perfectly predictable, but it involves changing in the mental grammar of people, unlike first-generation speakers. So I think this distinction is often not made. And people talk about loss, and they shouldn't be talking about loss. I mean, clearly there is individual variation. It depends on how much you use your language. It depends on the attitudes you have towards your own language, whether you want to continue to use it, whether you want to be identified as a speaker of the language or not. But there is no permanent loss.
Yeah, or it correlates with the amount of first language use in the life of the bilingual. I mean, I can confirm language attrition from the point of view of solving a crossword puzzle, which I tried to do last summer in Turkey, and it took me forever. I couldn't really answer most of the questions. But, these are usually not so high-frequency words in these crossword puzzles. And it's the problem of access, as you said. It's not completely forgetting.
I had the same experience by playing Scrabble with Italian people living in Italy. I was like, how did I not think of that word? Of course, it's there, accessing it. They're faster because they live in an Italian-speaking environment.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned language change within an individual's lifespan. And on that topic, I would like to move on to the other guests that we have. We're now joined by Christina Domene Moreno, who recently finished her PhD at the University of Würzburg on heritage speakers learning of English. Cristina, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Could you please tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Yeah, so as you've already mentioned, I recently did my PhD here at the Julius-Maximilians-Universität, and I also did my master's here a few years before that. And now I work at the university, at the JMU, as a lecturer and researcher. And my main interests are bilingualism research, especially in the field of phonology. So I'm interested in speech sounds mostly. And I'm also very interested in the interface between music and language. So how do these two interact, which also connects to phonology.
Yeah, fascinating. As I mentioned in the introduction, you've worked with Turkish-German bilinguals for your PhD project. What made you choose these speakers specifically? What makes them particularly interesting?
Well, there is a very, very large number of Turkish-German bilinguals of different age groups living in Germany. And this is due to the Gastarbeiter movement, which peaked in the 1960s in Germany. So starting from the 1950s, Germany made agreements with different countries, different governments to accept workers from certain countries to work in Germany for a couple of years. And during that time, about 850,000 Turkish workers came to Germany. And about a third of them did not return to Turkey as had been the plan, but actually stayed in Germany due to the very dire job situation in Turkey at the time. And they also, of course, then brought their families, brought their wives, their children. They also had new children when they were living here then. And the children of these immigrants then, of course, grew up and still grow up in bilingual situations where the language primarily spoken in the family is Turkish. And that does not match the community language German. Of course, those children are educated in Germany and then acquire German in schooling, in formal education. Nowadays, there are about 3 million people with Turkish background living in Germany. And this includes those children that are German officially. And the children that are growing up now are second or third generation immigrants. So the children and grandchildren of those Gastarbeiter. And I think that studying those, it's very practical to have such a large pool of speakers that are relatively comparable to each other. But I think it also makes sense from an educational perspective because, of course, these children are in schools. And I think it's important for teachers to be able to deal with the challenges by knowing more about these speakers and how linguistic structures are acquired by such speakers. Of course, this is not true only for Turkish speakers, but also for other immigrant speakers with similar profiles. So other speaker groups who came to Germany during that time were, for instance, speakers from or immigrants from Italy, from Spain.
Mm-hmm. I know that, judging from your last name, but I know you personally as well, that parts of your family are immigrants from Spain. Could you please tell us a bit about your linguistic background and how you think this background influences your own work?
Yeah. So yes, my father actually immigrated to Germany with his parents during this Gastarbeiter movement. So his parents were working in Germany during that time. They went back, as was planned by the government. But my father then stayed and married my mother, who was German. So I grew up in a potentially bilingual household. And I say potentially because my parents decided to raise me monolingual German only because they thought that I would, dealing with both languages would be detrimental. We've heard about this a bit earlier. So I grew up monolingual, but of course I was surrounded by Spanish a lot. I heard my father speak Spanish to his friends, to his family. We went to Spain for holidays and I was forced to talk at least some words in Spanish. So yeah, but I never really learned Spanish, and I think that that's a shame, really. I'm really sad about that. But I think it also gave me a very keen interest in languages and in language acquisition in particular.
Mm-hmm. So you basically missed that opportunity that was at your doorstep using Antonella's
Exactly. They didn't
metaphor.
open that door. Yeah.
So growing up, sort of hearing Spanish passively made you interested in languages, you said. Mm-hmm. And I think that constitutes a linguistic manifestation, sort of a linguistic effect of being bilingual, I guess, or being surrounded by other languages. And this, I guess, has also an impact on language learning and languages, like having additional languages in the society. Also has an impact on language use by individuals and members of immigrant communities or diasporic communities. I would like to ask you, what are some of the linguistic manifestations of being in a bilingual environment?
Mm-hmm. So bilingualism, and I think, this has been mentioned before also, bilingualism is, for instance, often associated with a higher ability to reflect on language on a meta level and to think and talk about language, which, by the way, is something that I feel also, although I'm not an active bilingual from birth, and we call this metalinguistic awareness. So when a child grows up with more than one language, they are faced, of course, with the often very, very different ways in which languages are structured, depending, of course, on how related they are. So, of course, the most obvious thing is that there are different words for the same thing, the same concept, but also different grammatical structures. So languages, of course, differ in terms of their word order. So do I place the verb before the subject or vice versa? Do I place the preposition before its referent? Do I say in the house, or do I say house in, basically, in other languages? And dealing with those linguistic differences in practice raises meta-awareness of these, of differences in general, of linguistic differences in general. And this is backed by a large body of research, and actually with a surprising degree of consistency that bilinguals actually do exhibit higher metalinguistic awareness comparable monolinguals do. Another interesting linguistic manifestation of bilingualism is code switching. So you may have overheard people talking on the phone, on the tram, for instance, and just seamlessly switching from one language to another and then back again. And already as a child, I always found this fascinating and exciting and beautiful, sort of. Some people may actually call this sloppy linguistic behavior, right? Well, why don't you just stick to one language and speak it right? But in fact, the process of code switching is highly complex, right? These switches don't just happen randomly. They happen at very specific points and are context and domain specific. So, for instance, if a bilingual talks to their parents on the phone and mentions in, say, Turkish, and mentions something about what happened at school, they may switch into German because schooling is the domain of German for them. Or when they get emotional, they may switch back into their heritage language, into their Turkish. Also structurally, so if they happen mid-sentence, if there is a switch mid-sentence, you, of course, don't want to butcher syntactic structures. So you have to make the switch at a very specific point in the syntax. So there's also a lot of online processing that's necessary to make code switching work. So this is everything but sloppy, right? Mm-hmm. And finally, in communities with a large number of young multilinguals of different backgrounds, we often find varieties that combine features from those different linguistic backgrounds. So, for instance, when there are a large number of, say, Arabic and Turkish and Russian immigrant children, And of course, given the right social circumstances, speakers often converge on one common variety in the community language. And they each bring their heritage-colored speech system into the mix. And then this variety is or may also be used, again, given the right social circumstances, by natives of the community language. We call this type of variety multi-ethnolect, and the multi-ethnolect spoken in large cities in Germany is called Kiezdeutsch. And one key difference between Kiezdeutsch and Standard German is its rhythmic structure. So while syllables in Standard German are relatively different from each other in duration, depending on which syllables are stressed, syllables in Kiezdeutsch are timed more evenly. So every syllable is similar in length, which gives the speech what could be perceived as a machine gun-like rhythmic structure. And this is something that can be traced back to the source language, to the heritage language influence from Turkish, say, which is naturally more, machine gun-like.
So talking about speech sounds, in your PhD dissertation, you also focused on how bilinguals perceive and produce speech sounds. Could you please briefly talk about your project in general and then highlight some important findings?
Mm-hmm. So generally, we know that when we learn a new language, when we acquire a new language sequentially, so later, slightly later in life, not simultaneously, we tend to transfer characteristics of our previously acquired language or languages into the language that we're learning. So we can trace the influence in the language that we're acquiring. And this surfaces, for example, in what we then perceive as foreign accented speech. So we hear the traces of the background language there. And in my project, my main interest was to see what happens concerning individual speech sounds if there is more than one language in the speaker system when they acquire a new language, and how the languages in the system interact and how this surfaces in that new language. So I tested Turkish-German bilinguals, as I mentioned before, with English as their third language. So they were acquiring English, which is, of course, the standard setup in German schools then for those speakers. And I focused on the way they perceived and produced a number of English speech sounds. I ran some tests on young learners who were in their first or second year of learning English at schools, and additionally, a group of highly proficient university students with the same or a very, very similar language biography. And overall, I could trace the influence of both languages in the English of the bilingual speakers. One example I can give for that is the Interdental Fricative, which you may know as the TH sound, right? The first sound in a thing. And this is a sound that is relatively difficult to articulate, and German learners often substitute this with a S sound. So saying sing instead of thing. We also know that Turkish monolingual speakers do not usually substitute this with S, but with a T sound. So they would produce ting then. And my bilingual participants actually did a mix of both, sometimes using S and sometimes using T. So both Turkish and German seem to have an influence there. And I found this also for other sounds, for vowel sounds. So the systems, as a mixed system, seem to be transferred into the L3, the newly acquired language. I also looked at the rate of success that the speakers had when perceiving and producing English speech sounds. And I found that the young bilinguals actually were less successful in perceiving and producing English speech sounds than a control group, a monolingual control group, so Germans learning English. What is important to note here, though, I then compared this to the older group as well, and I used the same type of comparison, and I found that this difference disappeared once they were more proficient. So while it may seem we could interpret, if we were very daring, this lower rate of success as a disadvantage on the part of the bilinguals, I would prefer to interpret it as evidence for a different path, for a different trajectory that the bilinguals take. Because they end up at the same stage. They are both highly proficient in the end. They both are able to acquire the language, but they do this in different ways, which makes sense because, of course, they have different languages in their system. This, however, does not make them worse. And I think that has important implications, again, for education, for educators, because just seeing a difference or seeing something that may look like a disadvantage in early stages does not mean that these speakers are worse at acquiring language. This doesn't work.
So basically the developmental trajectory, the path is different, and yes, we all get there at some point.
Yeah. Or we all can get there, yeah.
So I'd like to bring my two guests together now on the topic of bilingualism research. As a field of study, bilingualism is continuing to grow, especially as scientists from different disciplines such as linguistics, psychology, cognitive science, and education started to talk to each other and cooperate more than before. But this is an area of inquiry that certainly does not have a long history, despite the fact that bilingualism has been around for thousands and thousands of years. Now, science says bilinguals are not two monolinguals in one mind. How should bilinguals be approached in areas where their academic development, say in school, or their linguistic and cognitive capabilities in scientific research are assessed and measured crucially by means of language? Antonella.
Yes, I said something about this, I think, earlier. Definitely a bilingual or a multilingual is not the sum of two or more monolinguals. Unfortunately, many of the instruments and diagnostic tests, for example, that are used in educational environments, but also in health environments, are based on monolingual norms. We deal with this in our experience with Bilingualism Matters. So, because, as was said before, bilingual children go through stages when they acquire a language, they make certain mistakes, right, that are typical of acquisition, of developmental mistakes that are entirely predictable, but they could be taken as signs of delays, as signs of impairment, especially if bilinguals are tested with instruments that are typically developed on monolingual norms. So, how many words does a typical monolingual 6-year-old know in this language? Well, obviously, a bilingual child will know fewer words in that language, probably because they know the words in the other language or languages. And so we have to take that into account. So part of our mission, if you want, is to provide health professionals, for example, but also teachers and educators with enough knowledge about bilingualism and bilingual development so that they can develop the right kind of tests and instruments to measure bilingual proficiency in an objective way.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask Cristina also a question along these lines. Do you think bilingualism confer advantages? What do you think about this whole bilingual advantage that Antonella nicely mentioned and also highlighted the controversies? But I'd like to hear your personal opinion on this, Cristina.
Yeah, so there are areas where there is an advantage, or where bilinguals would outperform monolinguals in certain aspects. However, I think that we should see this less as a competition than we do right now. This is not about optimizing people, right? This is, and I think that we see this often parents may actually overdo this and force their children to learn 3 languages at the same time that have nothing to do with the family, that have nothing to do with the background. And I think, bilingualism, multilingualism isn't the holy grail. It's not a panacea, right? It's not something that, as we heard before, it doesn't make us more intelligent all of a sudden, right? So I think we should move away from this idea of measuring advantages or measuring up advantages versus disadvantages, right? And focus more on consequences of bilingualism and look at it in a more neutral way. That said, I think, if we have, and I agree with Professor Sorace on this, if we have a language at our doorstep, if we have more than one language, or if as parents we have the opportunity to give our children more than one language from the set out, then yes, we should go for it. And irrespective of possible advantages, measurable advantages.
It's like I said before, it's a great pleasure to have two researchers in one show, one a world-leading authority on bilingualism and another a researcher who is rather at the beginning of her career, both linguists dealing with the psycholinguistic aspects of bilingualism. I'd like to now ask both of you what you imagine the future of bilingualism research is. I'm asking this also for our listeners who might want to go into psycholinguistic research at some point. Antonella, where has the research so far taken us and where is it heading for?
I think I hope, in fact, that we're heading towards more and more interdisciplinary research. In order to understand a complex phenomenon like bilingualism, we need to get out of our comfort zones, right? None of us is an expert of everything, but together, if we combine our areas of expertise and our insights for common goals, we can actually make progress. And I know that, academically, this is not always easy, to combine because we are encouraged to do multidisciplinary research, but sometimes, it's not exactly easy to do that. But to me, the future of bilingualism research really, really involves being able to do interdisciplinary research. This is what we are trying to do in my university in Edinburgh. We are really trying to bring together the insights from different fields and trying to understand how they fit together. Because again, that is the challenge. It's not just, to say, well, this is how, what linguistics would predict, yes. But what do we know about individual cognitive profiles, for example? What do we know about the effects of particular experiences? What do we know about environmental factors and social factors? We need to put all of these together. It's a big challenge. But it's an exciting challenge.
It is an exciting challenge. Cristina, where do you see your research on bilingualism in the next few years if you were to be given the necessary infrastructure and support to carry out your studies?
Yeah, one thing that I would like to add to this interdisciplinary approach is that I would really love to work with more obscure languages. So I'm not saying the Amazon rainforest type of language, but as we've heard earlier, we are very, very Anglo-centric right now in research for practical reasons, of course, right? I would like to if I could, add different language combinations to that, go into more naturally multilingual societies as well that haven't been explored as widely as they should be, I think, and see what can be generalized, what findings, which of the findings that we have for English plus whatever can be generalized to bilingualism, overall bilingualism, right? So what are patterns of bilingualism versus what are patterns of English plus? So that's my desideratum, I think.
And I keep my fingers crossed for you for that. Today's guests were Antonella Sorace, Professor of Developmental Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, Fellow of British Academy and founder of the worldwide information and consultancy center Bilingualism Matters, and Christina Domene Moreno, lecturer and researcher at the University of Würzburg. Antonella and Cristina, I'd like to thank you very much for talking with us and sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
That was The Shades and Colors of Bilingualism. I'm Barış Kabak. The podcast technician was Daniel Dünchem. This program came to you from the University of Würzburg's audio studio in Würzburg, Germany.